Hi there. My name is Wynne Brown. And first of all, thank you so much to the Western National Parks Association for inviting me to speak today. And welcome to all of you to Independent Bookstores Day. I'm a huge fan of our independent bookstores, and I'd encourage all of you to support your local ones. You know, it's always a treat for me to talk to people who care about books and also to talk to people who care about history. I love stories, and that's really exactly what history is. In this case, I'll be talking about the story of Sara Plummer Lemmon. So what I'm going to do now is to share my screen, I hope. So I'm hoping that you're seeing the screen. And I'm going to tell you next a little bit about me. I'm a writer, editor, and graphic designer, project manager, and editor, graphic designer, project manager, and a poet. Someday I'll figure out what it is I want to do when I grow up. These are a few of the projects that I've either written, edited, illustrated, designed, or managed. In addition to the Sara Lemmon project, I'm currently working with several independently published authors to edit and produce their books. These are the books that I've written, edited, or designed, and they can be special ordered through a really wonderful independent local bookstore in Tucson called Antigone Books. After all, any season is book giving season. My background is a mix of journalism, biology, and scientific illustration, which probably explains some of my obsession, or at least my interest in Sara Lemmon. But really, mainly who I am is a storyteller. I'm lucky to have been around long enough to develop a range of tools to tell those stories. You can see more about that in my website, which, not surprisingly, is wynnebrown.com. This presentation will be recorded, and you'll be able to get to it through the Research tab on the website. So one of my favorite stories is about Sara Lemmon, and you can read snippets of that story in the project newsletter, which you can also get to from the Research tab of the website. The newsletter is free. I usually only send it out every couple of months, and it's very easy to unsubscribe if you decide you just don't want it. And unlike all the election emails we're all drowning in these days, I don't ask for money. Here's one of the best parts of the Sara Lemmon story. After researching 54 possible publishers, I sent queries to 24 publishers and agents and had 22 rejections. As it turned out, the 25th query was the magic one. Pandemic willing, my biography of Sara Plummer Lemmon will be published next fall by the University of Nebraska Press. Although UNP is an academic press, it'll be published under their Bison Books, their trade imprint for general interest readers. These descriptions are from the Bison website. I love the idea of being considered a writer of regional and international acclaim. So today's program, I'll do first a brief overview of the nuts and bolts of the project, the process behind it. Then I'll zip through a bare bones timeline of Sara Lemmon's packed productive life. And after that, we'll examine some of the plants she collected and see her paintings of them, particularly those in the Chiricahua and Huachucas, two mountain ranges in southern Arizona. Then, to wrap up, we'll tackle the who cares question, and you'll see, I hope, why I think Sara is a significant hidden figure of science. When I started this, I really had no idea of what I was getting myself into. About 10 years ago, I first learned that Arizona's Mount Lemmon is named for a woman botanist of the 1880s. Later, I read that the University of California and Jepson Herbaria archives in Berkeley had 10 linear feet of material on the lemons. My first thought was, wow, someone ought to do a book. Well, I now know there lie monsters among those words. The project basically has four tentacles, well, parts. Let's look briefly at each one of those. Reading her letters, cataloging her artwork, writing the actual book, and establishing an author platform. So the first part was reading, logging, and transcribing her letters. Sara was very close to her family, and she wrote home almost every week, especially to her younger sister, Maddie, Martha Plummer. Maddie married a man whose last name was Everett. Maddie Everett, fortunately, was a consummate keeper of correspondence. Talk about a gift to historians. Most of those letters have survived. Starting in 2015, I've made 3 trips to Berkeley to photograph 1,200 pages of Sara's letters. I then moved all those images to my hard drive in order to be able to enhance them because some of them are very challenging to read. Sara was kind of a frugal type. She wrote on one side of the paper, then flipped it over, wrote on the back side, and then she flipped it over again, turned it sideways, and wrote across her own handwriting. This is something that was very common in those days because paper was often not available or not cheap, and it's called cross writing. So the question then became, how do you keep track of 1,200 plus pages of correspondence? So my answer was to use just a simple word table, and I refer to this as the Project Brain. It was a 2-year project to go through all the letters, and it's basically a threefer. It's a timeline of Sara's life through her own words and the national global events. It's also a way for me to track what content was in which images, and it's also a checklist for what gaps I wanted to fill. So the second part was examining and cataloging her surviving artwork. And this gets us a little deeper into the Plummer family history. You've already met Sara's sister, Maddie Everett. Well, Maddie had a daughter, Sara's niece, confusingly also named Maddie. Maddie Jr. married a man whose last name was St. John. They then had a son, Harold St. John, Sara's great nephew. Harold grew up to be a noted botanist in Hawaii, and as you can see in this slide, the St. John Plant Science Lab at the University of Hawaii is named for him. So he and his mother, Maddie St. John, intended to write a book about the family, but they both died before finishing the project. However, Harold had 2 boxes of Sara's paintings stored in his house in Hawaii. And when he died, his granddaughter, who would be Sara's great-great-grandniece, donated the boxes to the archives at Berkeley in 2015. And here they are. All of the paintings are on paper. Partly because of their age and partly because of Hawaii's humidity, the paintings are much too fragile to handle. In fact, they're so delicate, the archivist didn't even know how many there were in the boxes because, as you can see, they're all jumbled on top of each other and starting to fall apart. The archivists were afraid to handle them in case they just crumbled to dust, and they wanted only a professional art conservator to handle them. But economic times being what they are, there was no funding. So I was very fortunate. Thanks to the generosity of various donors, I was able to hire a local Berkeley art conservator to examine and assess the work. And here she is. Susan Filter is a art conservator, and she did the conservation treatment for the Diary of John Wilkes Booth. And I figured pretty much if she could do that, she could be trusted with Sara Lemmon's paintings. So in 2017, my husband, Dave Peterson, and I spent a fascinating day in the archives with Susan. I'll get back to these images in more detail in a little bit, but there turned out to be 276 paintings. Some of them were just sketches, some were finished signed works, and there were even a few that weren't even by Sara. But Sara wrote notes on many of them, and there's a load of information in each image. Again, how does one keep track of all this information? So the solution that I chose is a database program called Tapforms, and I use that to include a thumbnail, the assigned image number, the identification of the plant, where the plant was, and the notes on the front and the back, and who the artist was. So these notes have actually, in this catalog, has led to a fascinating side trip to the Smithsonian, but I'll have to save that story for another time. So the next part was actually writing the book. And as you can see, I had some highly skilled editorial assistants. As many of you who are authors know, no book is easy. But after the years of research, I found this actually to be the easiest part. On April 1st, I turned in the 90,000 word document, and it's now past the peer review stage, which is a requirement for books published by an academic press. Now what I'm doing is addressing the comments from the acquisition editor, and next the manuscript will go to a copy editor and to the marketing and design teams. I still don't know what the title of the book will be. The working title is Rendering the American West, or it might be Like Death to be Idle, which is a quote from Sara. That'll be up for discussion with the marketing department. So part 4, oddly enough, it may seem counterintuitive to create a market before creating the product, but that's just how the publication world is these days. Publishers really want to know that someone will be interested enough to read, and preferably even to buy, the book. Therefore, I'm putting together a Facebook author page, I'm on Goodreads, I'm on Twitter, and of course there's the newsletter which announces talks and presentations. So, enough about the process. Let's move on to the story of Sara herself. She was born September 3rd, 1836, so her 185th birthday will be the same year this biography comes out. She was the middle child of 5. You already know about her younger sister, Maddie, and she also had 2 older brothers and a younger one. Here's a much later photo of Maddie and their father, Micah Jaw Sawyer Plummer. Micah Jaw served in the War of 1812, and then he moved to Massachusetts, and then to New Gloucester, Maine, which is where Sara was born. There's almost no information available about Sara's mother. It seems that she had some health problems, possibly both physical and emotional. Sara seems to have been much, much closer to her father than to her mother. As a child, she seems to have been a diligent student, if given to doodling. This is a school paper, and it was a very dry essay about the Sabbath. No wonder she wanted to spend some time doodling. At the age of 20, she left home, which by this time the family had moved to Dover, Massachusetts, and she moved to Worcester to attend the Ladies Collegiate Institute, where she earned a certificate in teaching gym, known then as calisthenics. That's particularly ironic because her own health had always been a little fragile. But after graduating, she moved back to teach gym in Dover. 1861 was a big year, both for the nation and for the Plummer family. In April, the first shots of the Civil War were fired. 2 months later, Maddie got married. I don't think there's a correlation between those two events. But Maddie's marriage may well have been why Sara decided it was time to get out of the house and move to New York City. She graduated from the Greenleaf Female Institute with honors and a double degree in chemistry and physics. She then applied to the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art. This is a really interesting educational institution that was established in 1859 and was open to all genders, all races, all ages. She entered in 1862 and she studied chemistry and physics at night and taught calisthenics and art lessons, private art lessons during the day. Peter Cooper must have been pretty impressed by her because she had a 3-year scholarship. Just in case that wasn't enough to keep her busy, in an interesting bit of foreshadowing, she also spent the 3 years volunteering at New York's Bellevue Hospital as a nurse for wounded Civil War soldiers. At that time, she may have crossed paths with Clara Barton, who would eventually be the founder of the American Red Cross. The 2 women later on would become very close friends. And again, working in a hospital is just highly ironic given Sara's own health. She had terrible respiratory problems. She often had bronchitis, pneumonia, catarrh, which is an old-fashioned word for inflamed sinuses. And then in 1863, she caught measles. I'll spare you her description of the oozing pustules all over her scalp, but she said the worst part was that she had to have her head completely shaved and wear a wig, which itched horribly. She did recover from measles, and for the next several years, she had a wonderful life in New York City. She went to art openings, concerts, she hung out with progressives and suffragettes, and all of this was while going to school and supporting herself, teaching art and calisthenics. There's a good chance maybe she had too good a time because in 1869, she again got pneumonia. This time, she was so sick that her ever loyal friends packed up all of her stuff and sent her to St. Augustine, Florida for the winter. Along the way, she stopped in Savannah. What's astounding to me is that this is her actual menu that she sent to Maddie as a souvenir. And I like to muse about, let's see, do you think she had the liver? Do you think she had the lamb? Or maybe the fried pig's feet? In any case, she went on to Florida where she remained for 4 months. Once she returned to New York later that summer, her health was still very shaky, and she realized that her very life depended on escaping the bitter northeastern winters. So she decided that she would make the huge decision to move across the country all by herself to California, where she didn't know a single soul. And it was not an easy jaunt. The railroad wasn't yet a safe way for a single woman to cross the continent. So instead, she went by the well-established mail route by boat down the East Coast, through Panama, and then up the west coast of the continent. She disembarked, gratefully, in San Francisco, and there she stayed for a month. Then she realized that her lungs still weren't up to the cold and damp. So she headed south to Santa Barbara. This photo was taken in 1875, 5 years after Sara arrived. When she got there in 1870, the population was just under 3,000 people. The streets were still dirt and they had grassy edges where the horses and mules grazed. The very first telegraph message was received from San Francisco in September of that year. Santa Barbara was lovely, but the intellectual stimulation was a far cry from what she was used to in New York City. Sara wrote Maddie, "It's like death to be idle." And worse yet, there was no library. So, Sara, being who she was, she rounded up donations of both money and books. I love where she says, prices as cheap as good articles can be sold for. As she recovered for her health and her stamina, she took long walks along Santa Barbara's beach and in the hills above the city. She was always insatiably curious, so she taught herself botany by using her artistic ability to sketch the plants. In addition to running the library, she was also one of the co-founders of the Natural History Society, which is still around today. This is the earliest painting that has survived of hers, and it was among those that were stored in Hawaii. And if you look carefully, you'll see all those brown spots. Those are called foxing. Here's a close-up. They could be spores, one of 110 types of fungus in the paper. They could also be tiny metal fragments from the processing of the paper. As we'll see later, sometimes damage to surviving artwork goes well beyond foxing. Even with all of her activities with the Natural History Society and the library, Sara missed the stimulation of New York City. So she also set up a salon, a lecture series, and that may well be what brought this man to Santa Barbara. So this is John Gill Lemmon, who often went by J.G. Lemmon, and he was born in Michigan in 1832, 4 years before Sara. He graduated from the normal school in Ypsilanti, Michigan, became a teacher, and then he became the county superintendent of schools. He'd started attending classes at the University of Michigan until the Civil War started, and he enlisted in the Union Army in June 1862. He was in 32 battles, and he also worked in between the battles as a nurse. And then, in August 1864, he was captured by the Confederates. And life as a prisoner started out as not being too bad. This is a letter that's actually survived, and he wrote home from the Florence prison. And in it, he asked the family to send him soap, hams, stationery, and a housewife. Apparently, he had a sense of humor. That didn't last long, because he was later sent to the infamous Andersonville prison. The photo on the left is J.G. Lemmon. The one on the right is not, but it's typical of what the few survivors of Andersonville looked like when they were eventually released. Conditions there were beyond horrific. John was released in 1866, and at the time he was one of 136 survivors out of 5,000, and they were the only ones who were capable of even standing up. Later on, he wrote that after a year of liberal diet, his weight had increased to 90 pounds. And this was a tall man. He was about 6 feet. At mustering out of the Army, J.G. traveled to Northern California to live with his mother and his brother. At that point, he was still so frail, no one really knew if he would survive, but at least he'd die among family. He'd always been interested in botany, and as he convalesced in his brother's front yard, he started learning the plants. Gradually, he gained strength and went farther afield to find plants. He sent the ones he didn't know to the state botanist, a man named Henry Bolander, in 1872, and they were new to Bolander too, so he sent them on to Harvard University's Dr. Asa Gray, the preeminent American botanist. John must have been just totally thrilled because he got a letter from Asa Gray that read, "Lots of new plants, but don't work too hard. Take good care of your health. The plants will wait for you. I congratulate you upon the change of a rebel prison for a California paradise." So it helps at this point to have a little bit of an image of or some context for what was happening in botany at the time. The late 19th century was a time of frenetic botanic activity. All of these people were botanists who were in touch frequently with both Sara and John Lemmon. And I call this slide the bounty of mostly bearded botanists. You could think of it as a planetary system, and all these botanists are orbiting around Asa Gray. 2 years after this picture was taken, John showed in 1876, John showed up in Santa Barbara, most likely at a lecture at Sara's library. It seems to me that John was also no slouch in the whiskers department. By this time, Sara Plummer had educated herself to become a knowledgeable amateur botanist. In 1877, she and one other woman were the first to be admitted to the California Academy of Sciences. She and J.G. hit it off as soon as they met, and they started botanizing together in the hills above Santa Barbara, and they soon became very close friends. J.G. was smitten with Sara. Within months, they both loved one another deeply. They had pet names for each other. She called him Lemonia, his scientific name, and he called her Amabilis, which is the name of a species of his favorite pine tree and is also the Latin word for lovable. In 1877, he proposed to her, but she turned him down, and the reason was because of their terrible health. She still battled pleurisy and other lung issues, and it sounds as if he very definitely had post-traumatic stress disorder from the horrendous treatment in prison. He's been described as nervous, twitchy, with a short attention span, often exhausted physically and mentally, forbidden to work apparently due to recurrences of his debilitating wartime condition. So Sara turned him down, and she wrote to him, "I've always said no one should marry unless in perfect health. It is most conclusive to my common sense that two unhealthy persons should never come together, even if the love be ever so strong." So the two of them resigned themselves to being botanical pen pals. And then she got sick again. In 1880, she got terribly sick with spinal meningitis. And apparently, she changed her mind about getting married. They were married on Thanksgiving Day, 1880, or as Sara described it to Maddie, they plunged into the matrimonial vortex. She was 44 and he was 48. She relocated from Santa Barbara to Oakland, where he lived, and moved in with him and his mother. Fortunately, everybody got along. The couple decided to put off their honeymoon. As John described it, My wife, being as enthusiastic and devoted to botany as I, was the first to propose that instead of the usual stupid and expensive visit to a watering place, idling our time in useless saunterings and listening to silly gossip, we should wait a few weeks, devoting the time to study. And then, at the right time, we should make a grand botanical raid into Arizona and try to touch the heart of Santa Catalina. So 1880 was a busy spring. Sara gave a talk, her first, to the California Academy of Sciences. It wasn't just her first, she was the first woman to ever speak to that group. They were also planning their honeymoon trip. And she wrote a letter to her father saying, "Tomorrow at 4 p.m., Lamonia and I start for Arizona and New Mexico on a botanic exploring expedition. I have long desired to see the far-off land of the Apaches, and then to go with Mr. Lemmon exploring and gathering the rare and perhaps new species of flora will be of sufficient delight to more than balance the fatigues consequent upon such a trip." Here's a map of their travels in southern Arizona over the next 2 years. So their first stop was the Santa Catalina mountain range, indicated with the red arrow. And here's a photo of Tucson in 1880. They traveled there by train. They set up camp at the east end of the mountain range, and they spent the next 3 weeks collecting plants and struggling to get to the top of the mountains from the south side, the side that faces Tucson. They failed every time. Finally, they gave up and they got in touch with a man named Emerson Oliver Stratton, who owned the Pandora Ranch on the north side of the Santa Catalinas. Stratton knew a route to the top, even though he'd never been there, and he provided pack animals to the 9,157-foot peak. Later on, he wrote, "We went to the highest peak of the Santa Catalinas and christened it Mount Lemmon in honor of Mrs. Lemmon, who was the first white woman up there." Here's a heartbreaking part of the Sara Lemmon story. Earlier this summer, a lightning strike on the west side of the mountain range ignited the Bighorn Fire. It burned for nearly a month and burned a total of 120,000 acres. In this slide, you can see the different colored areas which show the amount burned each day. And that red line running from north to south is the route, more or less, that Sara and JG and Emerson Stratton took on their honeymoon trip. Last year, Dave and I hiked that route, and I'm so glad we didn't wait. You can read the specifics of the route in the newsletter. So then the honeymooning couple went briefly to the Chiricahua Mountains. By that time, it was May and really hot, so they returned to Oakland for the summer and came back that fall once the rains had started. On this trip, they also spent 3 weeks in Rucker Canyon in the Chiricahua Mountains, and 11 days of which they were hiding from the Apaches in a tunnel with a crazed and sociopathic miner who set up a whole line of dynamite to blow the Apaches to smithereens, as he said. But you'll have to read the book for that story. But during this trip, right near what is now Fort Bowie National Monument, Sara discovered a new genus. Dr. Asa Gray described it and named it Plumera, honoring her maiden name. It's a yellow composite, sometimes called the Apache Pass rubberweed, or less elegantly, sneezeweed. So here's a picture of Fort Bowie in 1881. And here is an actual specimen of the plant that Sara collected, now in the Smithsonian. Having an entire genus named for you is a very, very big deal, and Sara was thrilled. She described her reaction in a letter to her father by saying, "I was so delighted with the honor and such a fine plant, 2 feet plus high, that I danced around our big herbarium, overturned the chairs, embraced Lamonia and Mother in the most enthusiastic way, and they joined me in the celebration." Sadly, the plant is no longer called Plumera. After some genetic studies, scientists realized it was part of another genus, and now it's called Hymenopsis ambigens. So you've seen one of her or some of her letters, and often when they were in the field, Sara just would simply write in pencil as a rough draft. Whenever she had time, she would try to copy them into her absolutely beautiful handwriting. And here's one that she copied explaining their plans to continue travel to Arizona and New Mexico. So here again is the map, because the following year in 1882, they returned to Arizona. And this time they went down to the Huachuca Mountains near what is now Sierra Vista. And that's where they intended to remain just for a couple of weeks. But it turned out to be such a botanical paradise, they ended up spending several months there. And here's a picture of what it looked like at the time. Most of the time they were within shouting distance of the fort, and that way they hoped that they would be safe from the Apaches. They lived in a tent, and she said that it was an umbrella tent. I wish you could see our rough outfit of 2 gray rubber blankets, old flannel vests and drawers, old boots and hats, a big lunch basket filled with corned beef, crackers, cheese, and 3 or 4 jars of nice currant jelly, brought in by good, thoughtful friends. The whole outfit and occasion brimful of interest and enthusiasm, if you will allow the expression. So let's look at a few of the plants that are still named for her, or that used to be named for her. This is a really exquisite little fern. And as you can see, it was first collected in the Chiricahua Mountains in 1881, named for her. And this one is Plummer's Morning Glory, again named for her. And this one is the Huachuca Mountain Spurge. It now has a new name. It used to be called Euphorbia plummeri, but again, that's been changed. And you may know spurges as those low spreading weeds that often show up every year in your yard. There's it flowering. This one is still carries Sara's name, and it's Allium plummeri, or Tanner's onion. And this is a stevia candy. The common name is candy leaf. The stevia is the same thing that you sweeten your tea with. Again, collected for the first time in 1882 in the Huachuca Mountains. And here's one of the specimens that was actually collected in the Huachucas. And the Lemmons spent, once they would go back to Oakland after being in the field all summer, they would send specimens all over the world, and they can still be seen. This particular one is Chicago Field Museum. Sometimes her name is hidden. We happen to know that Amabilis was her nickname, and since it was described and found by them, I think it's fair to say it's named by her, because we all know who Amabilis really was. In this case, it's been renamed, sadly, to something much less elegant. Biscuita means sticky. So in 1883, they came back to Arizona yet again, but they had to go home early because of sickness. There was a yellow fever epidemic, and they were also poisoned by the water at one of the ranches where they stayed. The following year, in 1884, they collected in northern Arizona, and then they headed straight for New Orleans because Sara had been elected the California Commissioner for the Women's Department and was in charge of a huge project. She was in charge of organizing the Pacific Slope section of what was known as the World's Industrial and Cotton Centennial Exposition, more commonly known as the World's Fair. The Lemmons spent 6 months in New Orleans, where they spent much of their time hanging out with Clara Barton and her field agent, Dr. Julian Hubble, and then they headed for a trip to New England so that Sara's family could finally meet her husband, her no longer so new husband. Sadly, they had to cut their trip to Massachusetts short because they got word that JG's mother was very sick. They ended up back in California but missed seeing his mother because she had already been buried by the time they got back. From then on, their annual pattern was that during the winter, they'd be back in Oakland, eking out a living by selling specimens, sending seeds to collectors. They produced several books, all illustrated by Sara, and they did frequent botany lectures. They spent a lot of their time camping with friends like John Muir and Clara Barton. and they often camped up at Weber Lake. Here's a picture of one of their camps. In 1886, this amazingly frail couple decided they wanted their very own piece of land, and they decided to file a claim to homestead 160 acres near Chelam, California, near San Luis Obispo. Thanks to the wonders of the internet, I was able to locate a map of their actual claim, and last fall, Dave and I found the actual site. This dead walnut that's here in the middle of the picture is next to the spring that Sara mentioned in one of her letters. They first set up camp in a canvas tent, but tragically, the second day they were there, someone set fire to the whole tent and burned almost everything they had. Undaunted, they ordered wood from San Luis Obispo, and they built a 10 by 12 cabin by hand. They also paid a man to fence the property. It was a nickel apiece for 400 oak posts, and then they paid an additional nickel for him to dig the holes, set the posts, and string the wire. The bargain, I would say. They lived there for 6 months. Sadly, nothing is left at the site. I was hoping to find, I don't know, a spoon with her initials or something. This is a letter that Sara wrote to her family about the fire, and she used a piece of stationery that had survived, and you can see here a sketch of the cabin that they built. To me, it's just amazing that they were able to do this. When they weren't out in the field, they spent winters working at the herbarium, and this is a picture of the herbarium in 1895 in a space that they rented. I look at this and I feel much better about the clutter in my office. By 1903, they had their own house on Telegraph Avenue and a new herbarium. Can you imagine moving all these papers and pine cones and paintings and art supplies? In addition to running the household, illustrating all their work, Sara was also an active member of the National Women's Club. She was a frequent speaker about the importance of forest conservation, and she was also a frequent speaker at women's suffrage events. In addition to that, she was very active in the Red Cross, probably because of her friendship with Clara Barton, and she wrote the history of the Pacific Slope of the Red Cross. This was no small accomplishment and not just some tiny pamphlet. It's a 486-page hardback book with many, many photos. In addition to that, I also discovered recently that she established the first training school for nurses on the West Coast. And in addition to all that, some Californians would tell you that this was her most important legacy, that of getting the golden poppy as California's state flower. It was a 10-year battle. The bills kept getting submitted, kept getting passed by both the state Senate and the state Assembly, and then the governor of the state would refuse to sign it, sometimes because he thought it wasn't worthy of being signed, and sometimes because of partisan politics. It seems some things don't change. But finally, Governor George Pardee signed the bill, and Sara felt triumphant. In June of 1905, the Lemmons returned to Tucson in order to celebrate their 25th wedding anniversary. They hunted up their old friend Emerson Stratton, and the three of them retraced their steps using 5 burros up the Santa Catalina Mountains. And this is the postcard she sent Maddie, in which she wrote, "We sleep in the open air beside a delicious mountain stream that sings our nightly lullaby." Sara was 70 and John was 74, which I think is pretty darned impressive. By now, she had made hundreds of paintings, and the question is, so where are they? And I'm afraid I know where a lot of them were. After that first talk to the California Academy of Sciences, Sara was a frequent speaker there, and she and JG often sent a lot of their specimens there. At one point, JG wrote to Asa Gray saying, "Mrs. Lemmon is doing 2 full-size paintings of the Huachuca plants, and we will frame them and send them all to the California Academy." I believe that at 5:12 a.m., April 18th, most of Sarah's paintings were lost forever. That's when the San Francisco earthquake hit. And as if the earthquake wasn't bad enough, fires broke out all over the city, including at the California Academy of Sciences, which was gutted. Sarah wrote her family that week, "We are safe, though tremendously shaken." I believe that both Sarah and JG were shattered by the loss of so much of their work. They also lost an entire year to helping other people. They basically ran an open house for people who had no lodging. John's health had been declining and was always fragile, and it continued to get worse. And to make it even worse, he lost much of his vision. Maddie later wrote that she believed that Sarah began having cognitive issues soon after the earthquake and fires. And on November 24th, 1908, John died. It was the very week of their 27th wedding anniversary. After his death, Sarah never really recovered. It was terribly sad. She came down with senile dementia, and with the dementia, she became profane, according to the death certificate, and she was discovered wandering around outside, sweeping the streets. Worse yet, this distinguished, elegant, brilliant woman had to be prevented from leaving the house unclad. The family had her committed to Stockton State Hospital on April 2nd, 1916. Appropriately enough, that happens to be Earth Day. 7 years later, she died on January 15th, 1923. The two of them are buried together under a stone that reads, "Partners in Botany." So what about her artistic legacy? Some of her work survives in black and white in books. Here are some of them. Here's the globe cone nut pine group of the shortleaf pines. This is the one that they traveled, that Parry nut pine, 500 miles to Baja California. You can see it signed in the right. Here's a really lovely drawing of the narrow-leafed pine. Now let's look at some of the images from those that were stored in Hawaii. This one is signed by her and dated August 14th, 1882 in Tanner's Canyon. I love to imagine her 138 years ago last week doing this painting. You remember I mentioned that sometimes the problem goes beyond foxing. This one shows some really horrific insect damage. And you can see notes on the back of this one. California pink poppy at the top, yellow California poppy and Mariposa lily. And if you very, very carefully, with the help of a professional conservator, flip over the painting, here's the front side. And there they are. I think it's interesting that the insects prefer their paper without pigment. I wrote a newsletter post about this particular plant. This is a Nettle Spurge, and again, it's signed at the bottom. And we were able to see the actual specimen that she collected. It's at the Nebraska State Museum, and here it is. The label is in Sarah's handwriting. And in keeping with 19th century time, she was always referred to as the and wife part of the collecting team. All the collecting labels are that way, and it's ironic because several authorities believe that it was actually Sarah who did much of the work that was credited to John because he had been so devastated by his war wounds. I'll spare you the feminist rant that's tempting. Here's a particularly lovely one, again, signed at the bottom, Mrs. S.A.P. Lemmon, done September 13th, 1882. Tanner's Canyon is now known as Garden Canyon in the Huachucas. Here's another of my favorites, the Columbine, again signed. And this one you can see some foxing. And this is the red-flowered alum root, also called the firefly coral bells. And don't know which mountain range this one is in. Here's a morning glory. And a threadleaf ragwort. This one's not signed on the front, but it is on the back. And this one is a thistle. this last one. And again, signed at the bottom and dated. So, in conclusion, why should anybody care about Sara Plummer Lemmon? To me, it's because she's a blend of so many stories. Of course, she's a story of art. Much of her work is exquisite in addition to being accurate depictions of plants that were then new to science. But her story is also about science. She had a national solid reputation as a botanist, and I would list her among the early women proto-ecologists. Her life is, of course, a picture of women's history and how women have, for many years, reinvented themselves again and again and again. Her life is also a window into Native American history. Her letters describe several indigenous tribes. It's also a window into military history. They often stayed at military posts around the country, and she wrote about them often. And the Civil War. Her marriage was haunted by that war and its effects on her husband. She had a tremendous legacy, of course, in Arizona, where Mount Lemmon is named for her, and numerous plants are named for her. There's a picture of Catalina Highway that goes to the top of Mount Lemmon. And of course, her legacy is throughout the Southwest with the plants she discovered and the artwork she did, and really more than just the Southwest, also the West. Last but not least, to me, this is a wonderfully romantic story of of a really unlikely partnership. These are two amazingly fragile and sickly but determined individuals, totally unsuited to traipsing around the wilderness. Yet they both loved botany and each other so deeply that they left a tremendous legacy. So I hope you agree with me that Sara is another hidden figure of both science and art, and she's worthy of so much more than just being a footnote in history and the title and wife, and that she so deserves a mountain in her name. Thank you again for spending this time with me, and do enjoy Independent Bookstore Day. Also, feel free to contact me with questions or to be signed up for the newsletter for updates about the book. Thank you so much. And again, thank you. I appreciate it, and have a wonderful day.